Hey everyone, Card Cafe here, ready to talk about some Fated Clash. Finally, it is here after months of waiting and Japan just getting super far ahead of us and already getting close to set 3 of Divine Z. We are here now finally with the Fated Clash, and I'm going to be talking about my main deck and favorite deck from the Fated ones. The Fated one of Unparalleled, Varga Dragres. Whichever one. Varga is what we refer to him as. And my nice, pretty silver rare that I have here. Very happy that I pulled this. It looks really good. I know they're not quite SPs, but I'll never say no to full arts because like, just look at that. It looks so good. But we got a lot to talk about. So let's get into it, starting with our ride line here. So we're... I'm running the Bob Sagra starter because it's also a nice little fancy SP. But, you know, the starters all do the same thing. When you're going second, you ride on it, draw a card. And then the grade 1 says that when you ride over him, specifically with Boulder Axe, you get to call him out of the soul in Soul Charge 1. So which is nice. He replaces his soul, which is good. And then he also just becomes an AK booster or attacker, depending on what you need in that situation. So it just helps you fill up your board to put on some early aggression, which is what you really want to be doing in this deck. And Boulder Axe is similar. When he's rode upon by Varga specifically, you call him out of the soul, and then he, on attack, gets 5k if you're on Varga. And if you chose to give him the 5k at the end of the battle, he retires himself, and you get to draw a card. So the first of a lot of cards we have in this deck that have the general theme of they retire themselves and you draw a card. So really good amount of hand presence in this deck and clearing the board, which is very important because of our main boy here. I'm sure he doesn't need any introductions. I'm sure most of you know what he does at this point, but he's a very good card. And let's talk about why. So it's got 2 skills. The first is just when he attacks, once per turn, you counterblast 1. And then you give him the skill that at the end of that battle, well, he gets 10,000 power, and then at the end of that battle, he restands with 0 drives. So what's important to note here is that it's that skill activates at the start of the battle. It's when he attacks, not at the end of the battle. So that's important when we get into the overtrigger conversation later. Just the noting that he will immediately lose the twin drive on the restand, regardless of what you check and what happens for the rest of the battle. So just keep that in mind. I worded a very specific way for a specific overtrigger that we'll talk about later. But what really makes this card good is not only just that he has 1 restand, but that he has 2. We all know about this, the new fancy divine skill effect that all these new bosses, well, some of these new bosses in Fated Clash have. That are once per game effects. So if anyone who doesn't know, any unit with a divine skill is a skill that once you use it, you cannot use it again for the rest of the game, and you cannot use any other divine skill from any other unit. You only get 1 divine skill per game, regardless of how many units you have in your deck with a divine skill, which matters more for next set when Keter, for example, will have 2. But his specific divine skill is at the end of the battle that he attacked. If your opponent is at 4 or more damage, you can counterblast 1, stand Varga again, and he will get +2 drives. So this is what makes Varga really impactful, is he's on your divine skill turn, your push turn where you're going for the kill, he will attack 3 times. So he'll swing once with your regular twin drive at 23 base, usually 33 if you're persona riding. Then he'll restand, attack again for 0 drives. And then if you divine skill, he'll restand again, attack for twin drive yet again. So twin drive, 0 drives, twin drive. Very strong. No discard associated to this either, which is very strong, even though you are going down to 0 drives on the second swing. The fact that there's no discard is kind of crazy for what this skill does. So very strong unit. Don't really need to explain why 3 Vanguard swings is an incredible amount of pressure for anyone to have to deal with. Now, because we really want to make sure that we're persona riding, we are running max copies of Varga as well as the Grail. You can run Bracing Angel Ladder if you're really scared of the Shur Nui matchup. But I find that Grail is just super important because you really, really want to make sure that you are persona riding on your second grade 3 turn. Because ideally, because of how aggressive this deck can be, both through the early and the mid game, you want to ideally be having your opponent at 4 damage or about to be pushed to 4 damage. So to make sure you get as much value as you can, you want to be persona riding to potentially just immediately go into your divine skill and end the game there. So you really want to make sure you're persona riding. So that's why I feel the Grail is just better all around than Bracing Angel Ladder. Because in any situation, you just want to make sure you're persona riding, whereas Bracing Angel Ladder is really only good against a few matchups. Just happens that those matchups are very good. So I understand the argument for Bracing Angel Ladder, but I think overall you just really want to make sure you persona ride. So 3 copies of him and then the Grail. And then to ride out our grade 3s, we are running the Obsidian Glaive Dragon, 3 copies. This is a cool card. Oh, I forgot to mention an important part of Varga, as I was supposed to say this. Varga also, on that first skill, when you counterblast 1, you wipe out everyone's front row. So yours and your opponent's front row, which is why it's good you have cards like Boulder Axe that retire himself in the front row. And cards like this that we're about to talk about with Glaive Dragon because of one of his skills, which is during your turn, if he is in the front row and you don't have any other units in the front row specifically with his name, then he cannot be retired by your effects. So he can't be retired by Varga's effect, and he gets 10,000 power. So it's a 20k3 beater, which is really nice, that just isn't retired by Varga's effect. And then his second effect is just continuous. If you have a grade 3 or greater with Varga in its name, he gets boost. So really versatile cards, why I run 3 of it, to either have it in the front row as a 23k beater that just stays on the board to be able to pass triggers to, or to push it into the back row to boost something else and be a really good booster for your 10ks, like Boulder Axe and other cards that we'll talk about, to make good numbers, because it's a 13k booster with a 10k is at least 23, 28 in Boulder Axe's case, and so on and so forth. So I really like 3 copies of this card for that versatility. Speaking of our 10Ks, for our grade 2s, we are running 4 of the Energy Cycler, the Drag Ritter boy. A very important card in this deck. So if anyone doesn't know, in Fated Clash, every nation got a version of this card. It's the new way to interact with the energy mechanic that we just got from the start decks. What this one does is, well, the same as all of them for the first skill, which is when he's placed on Guardian Circle or when he's discarded for Ride Line, you can Counterblast 1 or Energy Blast 3 to draw a card. So that's another great way to just have discard fodder for your Ride Line, to be able to just draw a card, similar to those cyclers from set 10 for the Soul Blast 1 bot deck, draw a card when discarded for Ride Line. Very similar here, they just don't go to the bottom of your deck. And instead of costing a soul, it's a Counterblast or an Energy Blast. So we like the versatility there of having the choice depending on where you're at in the game. And the fact that you can use these when guarding too is very nice, because it can potentially save you by drawing into a shield or even a perfect guard potentially that will save you that turn that you didn't have. So really great versatile skill there. But then each of them also have a second skill specific to their nation. And his is very important in Varga, because his second skill says, if you Persona Road when he's placed on rear guard, you can Counterblast 1 or Energy Blast 3 again, and choose a grade 1 or less from your drop zone and call them to rear guard. This is really important because, as you're going to see, we have a good amount of grade 1s in this deck that also retire themselves similar to Boulder Axe and draw cards. So this just allows you to get those cards back and use them again. So that's why we definitely run max 4 copies, because it just it's being used at every stage of the game. It's being used for discard for Ride Line, it's being used to guard during your opponent's turn, and it's being used during the Persona Ride turn. So max copies for that reason. Let's talk about the other main MVP of the deck, which is Drag Ritter Shur. A nice little silver rare. I got pretty lucky with my silver rares. Another 4 of this card is disgustingly good, and is always, I think, going to be effective in this deck just for what she does. So what is it that she does? She has 2 skills. First is when she attacks, you can energy blast 2, so pretty cheap energy cost, and she'll get 5,000 power. So right there, she becomes a 15k attacker, just like Boulder Axe. So with your boosting Glaive Dragon, that becomes a 28k line or 38 on Persona Ride. So we like that. But more importantly, the rest of the skill, you choose one of your rear guards and it gets the red text skill of when that unit is retired by an effect, you bounce it back to your hand instead of going to the drop zone. So that's huge, just like for Boulder Axe, for the grade 1s that we're going to talk about, or even just, I think I do a lot is with Varga's retire to the front row, you can even target this, your energy cycler, if you had called it for on the Persona Ride turn to call a grade 1 back, you target this with Shur and it just bounces back to your hand, and then you can use it for guarding on your opponent's turn. So just very versatile to be able to choose something that makes the most sense to put back into your hand when it's retired, and she allows you to do that just for Energy Blast 2. So very strong skill already just for that, but also has a second skill, which is when she's retired by an ability of your grade 3 or greater with Varga in its name. And if your opponent is at grade 3, specifically, you can't do this on your first grade 3 turn, unfortunately. When she's retired from that wipe the board front row skill, you counterblast 1, and you can recall her to the board, and she gets 10,000 power. So really good multi-attack extender, great part of your just combo kill turn where you're going for the divine skill, swing 3 times. So you get 1 attack, 2 attacks, 3, 4, 5 with the Vanguard, and then call her back for a potential 6th or 7th attack if you have Glaive still. So very strong card, just enables a lot of attacks in this deck, bounces things back to your hand, just so versatile, and definitely probably the best card in the deck. So you run 4. If you don't see her, it feels pretty bad. And rounding out the units in the grade 2 slot, we are just running max copies of Boulder Axe because he's just a really good card. We've already talked about what he does, just his ability to be a 15k beater and also just retire himself to draw more cards is just good. So he's just a good attacker and just gives us more resources. So 3 more copies of him. But then to round out the grade 2 slot, I am actually running 2 copies of the Blitz Order Destructive Roar. This is a really good card that I think is underrated and has saved my butt a lot of times already playing this deck. You've seen it on camera, I think, against Welstra, where I was able to use its skill there to a great effect. And what it does is when you play this on the Guardian Circle, you choose one of your other Guardians that's not a Sentinel, and it gets the skill that at the end of that battle, you bounce that Guardian back to your hand, and this also gets 10,000 shield. So it's a 10k shield that bounces one of your other Guardians back to your hand. So say I guard with like a crit trigger and then play Destructive Roar to guard targeting this. This is a 25k shield, 15 of which just gets bounced back to my hand to guard with again. So really clutch right now, especially in this meta, I feel like, where we just have so much aggression between the Stride decks, with this deck playing the mirror match. So like the faster decks from the earlier sets like Youthberg and Leonorn, this is just really useful to have. And I really, like I said, it's already definitely like put in a lot of work for me. It saved my butt multiple times. So I highly recommend at least running 1, but I really like having 2, so I like seeing it more than once. So 2 copies of Destructive Roar. But on to the grade 1s. I am running max copies of Impale Horn Dragon. A little SP and a little silver rare right there. Yeah, 4 copies of this. This is your main grade 1 for Varga. Another card where each divine skill unit got some variation of this card, where it's a 13k booster continuously if you have the grade 3. So in this case, if you're on Varga, this becomes a 13k booster. But then it has the additional skill where behind Varga specifically, so in the center back row, if it's boosting Varga, it gets an additional 2,000 power, which makes it a 15k booster and hitting numbers for Varga. And then also has the skill at the end of the battle that it boosted Varga, you Soul Blast 1, it retires itself, and you draw a card. So one of those great examples of the cards that retires itself to draw. giving you a lot of advantage, but also just making really good numbers, both for your rear guards with any of your 10Ks, like Shur, the Drag Ritter, or Boulder Axe, just making good numbers. But then also being a 15K booster for Varga, making Varga at least 38 because of his own skill, giving him 10K. 48 on a Persona Ride turn before triggers is just really big and hard to guard. So I just forward copies of this because you want to just really make sure you see this as soon as possible to throw it behind Varga, and then also have extra copies to potentially put behind other rear guards just to make good numbers. So 4 copies. Then the other gray main grade 1 we were running is 4 copies of Drag Ritter Mid-Hat. This is a pretty simple card that just goes into the theme of this deck, which is just when your Vanguard, actually when your unit, is stood by a card's ability, you retire this and draw a card. So when Varga restands, essentially you just retire this and draw. Or bounce it back to your hand if you targeted it with Shur. So just more examples of cards that remove themselves from the board, draw you cards, add advantage, and just clear off your board, which is good for Shiranui in particularly. And you're finding that, and you just, especially in the first grade 3 turn, where they're not able to call a unit from your drop zone to dominate. Having just a bunch of units that can just clear off your board so they have nothing to dominate in that turn is really nice. And then also they just draw you a lot of cards. You're most likely usually going to be sitting around 10-ish cards in your hand at the end of every turn that if you have the right setup. So more drawing is nice, and we just like having the ability to clear a board and draw cards. And then for the last main grade 1 slot, I am actually running 2 of the Kitty Cat. And the generic card that every nation, again, another card that every nation has a variation of this. This is the card that puts 2 copies of your ride line back into the ride deck face up to activate its skill, which is either on place on rear guard, in this cat's case you draw a card, or on the Guardian Circle it gets 15k extra shield, so it's a 20k shield. So most of the time you're using that for guarding. You're not, I haven't, very rarely do I use it for the draw effect. It's really to just be a 20k shield, because 20k shields are just so valuable right now in the meta, especially with other Vargas running around. Shiranui still Luard, like having a higher shield value is just very important. So I like having 2 cat just for 2 extra 20k shields essentially. And then lastly, of course, shocker, 3 Nation Perfect Guards and the Sanctitude. We all know what these do. The Perfect Guards for the nations don't have to discard for 1 or less cards in hand. And then Sanctitude, very important right now, because it allows you to also not have to discard so long as your opponent is on a grade 4 Vanguard. So you're using for that. And then also, because it's going to the Order Zone, not the Guardian Circle, it gets around most card restricts. Straightforward there. Now for the triggers. Pretty straightforward. This is a restanding Vanguard deck, so we are doing 8 crits. I'm not running any of the effect crits. You don't... Soul's not really a problem in this deck, and the 2k is doing nothing for you. And I'd rather have the 5k, and that is just to make numbers if I have to emergency call something. Plus, look at these little new Grail Metal crits. They're just so cute. I couldn't resist not running that. So running 4, if you want to run 4 of the Go to Soul ones, feel free. There's no real reason not to, other than just the emergency situation where you might have to call one and it's not making good numbers, but it doesn't super matter. I just like them because I like the new little Grail Metal crits. Now for the off trigger, I have honestly been going back and forth on this. I'm doing 3 draws for now. This little, let's see, you can do some of the high rarity stuff in this little SP. I would like to run fronts, and I think fronts is definitely not a bad idea, mainly again for just more 20k shields than anything else. The problem with the fronts is offensively, the majority of the time, because of how Varga works, you're not going to have 2 standing front row rear guards. You're probably only going to have 1, in which case a front is less effective, because then only 2 things is getting plus 10 Varga and that 1 rear guard, which certainly isn't bad. But at that point, the argument for maybe just having 1 thing get 10k and all, but netting you an extra card becomes stronger. And obviously defensively checking draws is much stronger than defensively checking fronts. So I'm doing draws for now. I very well could change this to fronts, still, again, mainly for the 20k shields. I just don't, it's a tough call. Either one honestly works so long as you're doing 8 crits. Draws for now, just because you have some very important pieces that you need to see early, that having to rely on your other draw engine could potentially not get them to you until they're too late. So a few extra draws can also just help find those pieces. Heal lineup. I'm doing 2 of the grade heal. The heal that says if your opponent is a grade higher than you, then it's 20k shields, mainly because of just all the Luards and Shur floating around. 1 restand heal for the Varga matchup and also for Shur, and then 1 generic, mainly because I have an SP. If you wanted to do 2 of the restand, I wouldn't blame you because of the current meta state. But I always feel comfortable at least having a generic around just for the 15k solid shield, regardless of the situation. And again, I would be lying if I said the main sell wasn't because it was an SP. But it's kind of up to you. I would recommend definitely at least 2 great heal because of Luard and Shur right now. We didn't get the restriction, unfortunately, so those 2 decks are still at full power, which means they're the 2 best decks in the format. So you definitely want 2 great heals. And definitely at least 1 restand heal because of Shur and the mirror match for this deck. And then that just leaves the OT reveal. What overtrigger are we running? Well, we are running the blue OT. I alluded to this at the beginning. The Dragon Empire OT Drag Veda does not really work with Varga. And that's because they specifically worded his skill to not work with Drag Veda. Now, could you get lucky and drive check Drag Veda during your divine skill swing where you got your twin drive back? Yes, 100%, in which case you might as well go get a lottery ticket, because that's about the luckiest you're ever going to get, and you just got 4 Vanguard swings, 3 of which had 2 or 3 of which had twin drive. So yes, in that very specific instance, Drag Veda is still viable and works, but the majority of the time you're going to just restand with no drives because of how Varga is worded, even if you check Drag Veda. The Drag Veda check does not override Varga's skill minusing his 2 drives on the second swing. So, and you could argue that still getting 4 Vanguard attacks, 2 of which have no drives, is still pretty impactful, and you're not necessarily wrong. But it's less impactful, I feel, than this, because this gives a crit, and we have a Vanguard swinging 3 times. And I feel if you have a Vanguard swinging 3 times, each of them having a crit and 100 million is potentially more impactful than having 4 Vanguard swings with no drives for the most part and no extra crit. Plus, getting something back from your drop zone can be nice because there's no way to recur Shura, for example, from the drop zone. Or Drag Veda. Like, there's pieces that are important in this deck that you cannot actually get back. You can only get back grade 1s from the drop zone. So this being able to get those pieces back is nice. And then really the crit is the main thing of just a 9th crit trigger in a Vanguard deck that swings 3 times. It's just pretty strong. If you check this on Varga with the ability to do your divine skill, that's game over. They're not going to stop 100 million with crit 3 times that they're at 4. Like, that's just not happening unless they drew all of their perfect cards. So blue OT, I think, is definitely the way to go. The new OTs just got revealed a little bit ago. And I have been thinking about both of them. I think both of the new ones, the light and the dark OT, might have merit in this. I think you can make arguments for both of them. I'll probably play around with and see if there's one I like more than the blue OT. We'll talk about that more when those come out. But for now, I think blue OT is definitely the way to go. And yeah, so that is my Varga deck profile. I know there's definitely some differences here from what I've seen other people doing. I'm running some more defensive options, but that's really because of the mirror match and trying to design this a little bit to handle the mirror match and also the strike decks, because they pack punch and I want to make sure I can survive through their turns to be able to punch back. So that's why I run extra copies of defensive roar. I run the kitty cat very strongly considering putting the fronts back for more 20k shields, just to try and make sure I survive so I can kill them on my next turn. So yeah, that's Varga. I like this deck a lot. It's a restanding Vanguard Dragon Empire deck, so speaks to my soul as someone who loved Overlord back in the day. So I'm very happy with this deck and having a lot of fun. I'll be showcasing a lot of other stuff on the channel for Divine Z's because we're just so excited it's finally here. Yeah, so let me know what else you guys want to see and what you guys' thoughts are on Varga, and we'll be talking to you soon. Thanks. Bye.